Okay, good afternoon and welcome back to sessions on weathering with, in this case, acrylic paints. I'm going to talk about a couple of techniques to mix paints for use on weathering wagons. First thing I'm going to do is talk about green wagons. Okay, so Engineer's Olive is a really tricky colour if you want something that isn't brand spanking new. So I'm going to bring this in. This is a Ferry tube, and that is Engineer's Olive straight out of the jar, rail match paint. And that's a really good colour match. That is Engineer's Olive. But actually, when you look at pictures of things that are meant to be olive green, they're everything but that colour. So here's Hornby's version of Engineer's Olive, and if I put that in front of it, you'll see that it's not quite as dark. But it's not really wrong, because actually olive green fades quite quickly when these wagons are parked still sat in sidings for 5 days waiting for something to do. So when you look at pictures of another tube wagon that's in use as a wheel carrier, that is an entirely correct colour of faded olive green. And actually when it fades even further, it starts to get a brownish tint to it. This is another wheel carrier in use on the Southern. And these are all variations on olive green, and everything in between is also an entirely viable colour. So if I take these out of the way, bring in the air brake bolster C conversion. It's a different shade of green again. I mean, it's still obviously Engineer's Olive, but it's not as dark as brand new. And then if we look at some dogfish and catfish, there's 3 wagons there. Move that out of the way for you. They're all slightly different shades of olive green, and they're all not quite as dark as a brand new X-Works wagon. And finally, what happens to olive green paint when it's painted onto wood is, instead of going the colour that it goes on that wheel carrier, which is a slightly browny green colour, it actually goes brown. When it's painted onto wood, olive green paint will eventually end up as a very light dark earth colour. And again, this is based on a photograph that I found on the internet of a wagon where planks had been replaced and painted in new Engineer's Olive. So again, it's quite an odd colour, but that's how Engineer's Olive ends up on wooden wagons. On steel wagons there's a slightly different tint, and that must be down to both the properties of the material. So in this case, wood will tend to react differently to primers and top coats than metal, and also the undercoat and the top coat that's used, the formulation that's been painted onto it, all sorts of things will affect the end state of a pot of paint. And all of those colours, aside from that very first wagon which came straight out of the pot of rail match, were not based on taking the rail match paint and adding colours to it to lighten it, like a neutral grey, for example, to try and lighten the shade. They're actually mixed from the bottom up, and I do that using Games Workshop colours. So, good old black. This is a Bad on Black, which is the base paint version. There is also a layer black as well, which you can use. A base colour called Castellan Green, which is effectively army green, and use that on a lot of army paints. There's a colour called Death World Forest. Now that is actually what this wagon is painted, so it's straight out of the pot. So instead of mixing a colour, I've just used a shade. There's Baneblade Brown, which is a light dark earth, and that's actually the base colour for that wood effect. And then good old Tamiya Khaki. Now that's the colour that I mixed in with those to give me the various shades that I've used on all of the other wagons. So the Bolster C, the 3 Dogfish, and a number of other Engineers wagons that I've done in various states of faded olive green. They're all done with these 3 colours only. And mixing them is really easy. The good thing about water-based acrylics is you can mix pretty much any range together. So if I had a rail match colour, I could use that as well. These new Tamiya formulations are also water soluble and mixable with other water soluble acrylics. So I'll just show you the colours that you can get from these 3 paints. So let's just get a dab of black. Just going to put that on there. I'm going to get a dab of this dark green. So if I pop the lid off, you can see that it's a sort of an army light bronze green. If I mix that in, give it a good stir, mix that colour together, and what I've got is actually something that is pretty close to Engineer's Olive, straight from the get-go. And that's just an equal mix of that Castellan green and Abaddon black. And that gives me fresh Engineer's Olive. It's a little bit less black than that, but that's within the tolerance of the undercoats and top coats. But if I add a little bit of the khaki to it, what happens is it starts to lighten it. It starts to give you those faded shades. So now I've got a colour that's fairly faded without being completely gone. It's still recognisably that dark olive, but now it's less dark, and that's the colour that I've painted on some of the catfish and dogfish that I've got. And then I can keep going, so I can lighten it, I can go further, and I can take it down to a much lighter faded shade. And all of these colours have all quite happily mixed together. I can thin them with a little bit of water, get them to flow on the surface, and that means that I can get a couple of nice thin even layers on. And with a large brush like this, there aren't any brush marks. All of the models that you see there that I've just talked through, apart from the Hornby Ready to Run one, have all been hand painted. None of them have been airbrushed, except for the undercoat, which comes out of a rattle can. So they're given a black undercoat, and you can get black undercoat from Games Workshop, from Halfords, doesn't really matter. And then the top coat is painted over the black. Again, that's a kind of military modelling technique which allows you to effectively pre-shade a model, so that any areas that you've missed with the brush will already have a shadow in them. I tend to put 2 or more coats on these models, and so actually the shading will disappear overall. But because you've already got black on there, if you miss bits of the underframe underneath, or if you can't get your brush into some areas on the model, that doesn't really matter because they're already going to be dark, they're all going to be in shadow. Anyway, that's shades of green, and that's how I work my way through those shades of green. I'm going to clean the brush off now, and when we come back in a minute, I'm going to talk about shades of grey that aren't quite black.